Hello and welcome back to the Accelerated Webinar Series on Demand, where we talk about everything it takes for a faster go-to-market strategy for medical devices and also what constitutes a good strategy for medical device companies looking forward from today. This series is developed and brought to you by Aventec in collaboration with Dassault Systems. I am your host and moderator, Shashank Nani, and today we're welcoming back Stuart Wright and Stephen Levine from Dassault Systems. Thank you for joining us. So, Steve, Stewart, in the previous conversations that we've had, we've largely spoken about technical capabilities and the value that modeling and simulation can bring. When you simulate and model the condition that you're trying to solve as a medical device manufacturer or designer, and also to simulate and model the variations virtually, and then to add to that, the evolution of what used to be a craftsman art form of being able to do appropriate FEA, CFD analyses or electromagnetic analyses, and now being able to do that at scale. So, using automation, using Monte Carlo and other simulation capabilities that Dassault has kind of aggregated into one platform. But today I would like to refocus, and the purpose of this is an everyday medical device company that is in the market today, they are going to not be working in that altruistic, you know, marketing centric way. That's great verbiage to sell the company, to sell the mission, to sell the vision. But the everyday engineer, the everyday manager, the everyday VP, when they make decisions, they're going to be making decisions based on goals that they've set in the short term, goals they've set in the midterm, goals they've set in the long term. And a lot of this strategic goal setting does come down to the ultimate vision, but it's not driven by the ultimate vision in terms of the way they articulate the goals. I draw back from my experience when I used to be in the aerospace industry. Yes, our goal was to connect people worldwide to make excellent aircraft, but our day-to-day goals were very different from that. They were all tied down to improving the quality of our products. Literally, like my deliverable for that week. The goal was to have fewer errors so that we spend less time correcting those errors. And then when I think about several levels higher at the director level, when they're looking at like a 3 month overlook of what they need to be doing, they sort of, yes, they look at the KPIs of quality, productivity, but they're more interested in the way the business system works. So they think more about, okay, are our engineers gathering more knowledge that can later on be applied at scale? So is our core capability increasing? Right? Are we making the right investments in the right programs, in the right systems? And are those systems actually operating at the efficiency that they need to? So thinking about all this in the aerospace industry, in the automotive industry, and now in the medical device industry, what really comes down to, or I think what makes an impact on the everyday decision making, is how close are those decisions to providing the company a strategic and competitive advantage. And that's what the conversation will be about. And I want to reference a book that I've been reading. It's by the former chairman and CEO of Procter and Gamble, A.G. Lafley, and Roger Martin. He's a former dean of the Rotman School of Management at the University of Toronto. Sorry. They talk about strategy in a very systemic way. They talk about strategic goal setting as to what the winning aspiration is of of a certain organization. They talk about identifying where to play, as in identifying which market segment, which niche to attack, and what position to attack from. Then they talk about how they will win, defining exactly what their differentiators will be. And a lot of this comes down to deciding ahead of, like early on, we're going to play this particular way. And that will become more apparent and clear when we get your feedback. And ultimately what core competencies they need to develop and invest in, and finally what management systems they need to have to support their choices. The book is called Playing to Win. Has either of you been familiar with this book at all? Yeah.
Yeah, I am aware of that. I haven't personally read that one, but I do know that AG took a number of pages out of Clay Christensen's philosophies and his books on innovation and innovation strategy, how to innovate, where to innovate, when to innovate. So somewhat, yes.
So based on at least Clay Christensen's work, how do you see that being applied in medical devices today? Like, what I would like to get at is basically strategies about choices. Would you agree?
Yes. Strategy is about implementing a million little tactics as well. And a million little tactics need maybe a million little decisions. And I think that's what you were referring to, all of these decisions that happen at the ground level that add up to something meaningful, revenue generating, or differentiating in the marketplace.
Exactly. And a lot of these choices do come down to some very typical decisions that we as companies that work with us, so as we see on a day-to-day basis, where a medical device company will come in and ask the question, should we use SolidWorks or CATIA, right? So the choice to use a certain tool to design because it allows everybody to collaborate better is a strategic choice, right? The choice to, develop a core competency with FEA, CFD, and electromagnetics, that is a strategic choice because it allows you to ideate better products. So, or the choice to implement a key PLM system, whatever the case may be, I think strategy does come down to making those choices, and the way it manifests for the medical device segment is making these decisions about what to invest in, what tools to get, what business systems to implement. And while I find that being patient centric and being customer centric is marketing heavy, I do find that yes, if that philosophy is driven down and everybody within the company that makes medical devices understands exactly how their day-to-day decisions impact that, I think people will be more adept at making those decisions. So what I would like to do today, or start off with, is take a look at the key segments that we discuss in medical devices, which is drug delivery devices, cardiac devices, implantables, ingestibles, or generally like the highly complex medical devices that are multidisciplinary systems. They have electrical, they have data-based systems, they have you know, all in all, just generally complex devices. So what I would like to highlight is what makes these key areas or segments within that industry highly competitive, that so many people are entering into that particular flavor of product development.
Steve, I think I'd like to let you comment on the overall industry dynamic that's bringing so many new players in.
Sure. I'll give my perspective. As with all industries, the market is fairly complex. But I think what's happening, well, the dynamic that tends to happen in the medical device industry is that it moves in waves. Those waves tend to be governed by some kind of breakthrough technology that offers a new treatment that didn't exist before. The nature of the business is the first person to demonstrate a methodology to treat a particular illness or condition can be very costly because they have to go through all the effort to organize, define the problem, uh, not just invent the new device, but actually prove that the methodology works, that it's safe, and educate the community, the practitioners, the doctors, the hospitals, the patients that are going to sign up for it, and ultimately the regulators. And through that entire process, which can take more than 10 years, the first one through the gate, of course, usually receives a lot of the benefit and becomes the market leader. But then it creates a foundation of knowledge that now many companies can then enter with new versions of ways to solve that existing problem much more cost effectively. And so we see more and more of that innovation is happening more rapidly as the industry is now maturing. So we're seeing these breakthroughs happen on a more regular basis now, which means there's more of secondary and tertiary companies that are able to come through and create new and innovative versions of those breakthrough devices. Uh, what and we're all, of course, very excited about that because we now have real transformation, real renaissance ongoing in the medical device industry, where so much of the mind share went to drugs. Many more are going to devices, which give people very uh, often very good options, because typically devices have far fewer side effects than drugs, because they can be targeted specifically to the precise problem. And so if you can solve a problem with a device, it's usually better than a drug, which is the opposite of what historical thinking is. And of course, we believe that the use of simulation will dramatically lower the bar to that first innovation, the first wave demonstrating that a new technique can be effective and safe. And of course, we've been working with the FDA on that topic, because they believe the same. If they can lower that first wave, uh, flatten the curve, if you will, so that the first one can get through quickly, then the innovation cycle could be much, much more dynamic and much more like, say, the high tech industry, which, of course, has been completely transformed in the last decade or two.
I certainly like what you said there, Stephen. I think it aligns very closely to. I've already referenced Clay Christensen and his theories of innovation. I think what you said aligns quite closely to that. The groundbreaking activity you talked about, it probably is harder to accomplish in the life sciences industry than other industries, because of all of the regulatory control and how hard it is to get first approval. But that's what Clay would have considered perhaps transformative innovation, something new, something different, accomplishing an outcome in a different way to the way it's been done before. And every company has to have a portfolio of that, I think, or at least every company that wants to lead in a marketplace. They have to have innovation that hopefully will pan out and be transformative to a subsegment. But then they also have to have a very significant part of their portfolio dedicated to sustaining innovation, innovation that where incremental improvements are being made to existing product lines, perhaps more sizes in the portfolio, perhaps slightly different features and improved functionality, stuff that's harder to gain, less difficult to gain approval for because it's an incremental change, but also keeps them that one step ahead of the competition. And then you have the third level of innovation, which I think is where we see an awful lot of the small companies entering at, which is to offer cost innovation. In other words, solutions at a different price point to what the big guys perhaps offer. Solutions that are less expensive, but no better than what everything else that's on the market. And I think we see an awful lot of that activity also. Let me make a comment about innovation, and you might want to cut this in at some point, Shashank. So every company needs to maintain a balanced portfolio of innovation, and it ranges from cost innovation through sustaining innovation to transformative innovation. And managing that balanced portfolio can be very difficult. It's also what drives an awful lot of their staffing, their organizational structure, their assignment of projects and programs. Now, let me make another comment. The other comment was going to be on value. You started talking about decisions. So a thought went through my mind about decisions. So we hope that every decision that gets made within an organization is at least somewhat value-centric. And what we mean by that is there's a value associated with making a decision in one direction or another. And we hope that companies, ourselves, we make decisions that are oriented to the highest value. But value comes in different flavors. There's economic value, of course. That's what we tend to think about most commonly. But there's also personal value and social value. The personal value is a decision made that benefits us personally, and perhaps additionally to economically. And then the social value is a value that benefits the environment and the society in which we operate. So we have to think in those three different frames, but I think economic value is ultimately what shareholders see for any company. Most companies, they operate largely with a principle of economic value, but individuals, they operate with all three dimensions coming into play. Should I do this or that? Well, what's in it for me? What's in it for the work group and the environment I work in? And then what's the economic impact of the decision I make? And I think all those individual decisions, they ladder up as little tactical decisions, they ladder up to make strategic impact at higher levels.
Okay, yeah. Let
So
me also add, a comment. I think because value is always a good underlying foundation when you're thinking about a business, and ultimately, if you stop providing value, it's the beginning of the end of your business. So one of the big questions you have to ask, or one of the unique things about the medical field is, particularly medical devices, is you actually have to think about who you're providing value to. They have multiple customers, and you'll often get different answers if you ask, "Well, who's your customer?" And your typical response will be the profile of the target patient that will receive the device. But of course, that patient is not who they go to get requirements, which is who you would normally think of when it's a customer. They're not doing the buying, right? So it's more typically a medical professional, doctor, surgeon, etc., who's doing the making the decisions and providing input into the design and the requirements and the needs of that device. So if you're not providing value to the doctor who has a different need than the patient, so both have to get value. And of course, you've got some kind of an organization you've got a hospital that may be doing the buying. You've got the insurance company that's doing the paying. So the insurance company has to believe that the cost equals the value you're providing, whereas the patient may just say, well, I feel better, so I'm happy. But the insurance company has to make sure that the cost is worth that increment. And often it's the doctor that's the arbiter, and especially with value-based um, payments that are on the horizon, it becomes more and more important that all of those customers see value along the way. And that adds a lot more complexity to the industry than many other industries have had.
so can we say that just because there are more ways of providing value, and when you think about it like that, it does make sense, but is it purely because there are more ways of providing value that this arena is becoming more competitive, or is something interesting happening, especially as you mentioned with simulation, that companies are now able to, especially with the regulatory bodies being on board and accepting simulation and scientific evidence provided through simulation, that they're able to innovate a lot faster. They're able to reach, that technological breakthrough or that medical breakthrough through medical devices a lot earlier. And I think that's making a lot of knowledge available. So ultimately, yes, value is being provided to the multiple stakeholders within the medical device community, but I feel like the amount of knowledge that's being generated as a result of, the faster pace of innovation, I think that might primarily be responsible for why new entrants are coming in. So, like, on one of the events we had in November last year, we had this innovator from this company called Dynacardia, and they were making continuous blood pressure measurement medical device. And um, what they said was this was a revolution as far as the application that this could be used for, to monitor somebody's drug delivery based on their blood pressure, and just the amount of work that they could do by bringing this innovation to market. So I feel like the knowledge that's being generated through this rapid pace of innovation is primarily responsible for more entrants in the market. But it's becoming harder and harder for each company to distinguish themselves, not just purely in the value that they provide, but also in the work that they do on a day-to-day basis. And this kind of goes back to what Steve, you and I were speaking about earlier, which is how do you decide what to work on a short, mid, and long-term horizon level?
Well, yeah, absolutely, Shashank. I think those, as we alluded to, the strategy, those strategic decisions on what problems to solve are essential. And from our perspective, I think we believe that simulation is really a key technology in helping to make those decisions because it fundamentally provides you with the best way of replicating the real world so that you can understand what's happening. You can understand the problem in the most depth you can possibly do it. If you can replicate what's happening, even if it's not precise, but if you can capture the salient key parts that control that govern the condition that you're looking at, then you have the ability to bring together a team of people to help devise the right solution and to understand what's likely to give you not just uh, immediate relief but long-term relief, and ultimately it's those long-term effects that uh, govern the success of a product line.
I think the connected world we now live in also has a lot to do with the ability of new entrants into the marketplace to be successful. It's much easier for them to develop core capabilities because of the mobility of people. Um, Information is much more freely available than it might have been 30 years ago. And so they can very quickly become pretty well educated and well informed on subject matter of relevance. And they can very, very quickly come up to speed on the best practices that are being used in industries. So I think it's a lot easier to become a new entrant and develop an incrementally improved product than it used to be. That dynamic has a lot to do with it.
Interesting.
But I think also simulation as a tool is becoming much more endemic in life sciences. Um, Take a look at, I always refer to automotive as a reference, the automotive industry. Take a look at the automotive industry. You will not find an automotive OEM that is not systematically using simulation throughout their development programs. You won't find one. Indeed, you won't find a tier one automotive supplier that doesn't use simulation systematically. You may find a few tier two suppliers that aren't really leveraging simulation to its greatest potential. But really, that's a statement about how important simulation can be as a capability in an industry in supporting the innovation objectives of that industry and of individual players. And I've said it before, the life sciences industry, for whatever reason, various reasons, is late to the game in extensive leverage of simulation. But we are now on an accelerated path for the integration of simulation systemically within programs. And I think the accessibility of this kind of capability to new entrants is part of what fuels their potential for success.
Yeah,
Go
that's
ahead,
a
Steve.
good. Well, it's a great point, Stuart. And I think there are, of course, um, many differences between the dynamics of the automotive industry and life sciences. But there's a lot we can learn, particularly from the automotive industry and their journey to go from their inability to capture the entire environment of an automobile, which, if you look back several decades, was impossible with the level of technology it was then. But now it's essential, and they went on a journey, and life sciences we see going on that journey right now. And I think fundamentally there are many things that they learned, but what really sticks out to me was that in the early years, which is where medical device industry is today, there's still primary reliance on physical testing and then secondary reliance on simulation to only fill in the gaps where the physical testing can't provide a good sufficient answer. And that's where you start, and that's where the life sciences industry is now. And the automotive industry was that way for many years as they learned how to use simulation. But what they realized was what they were getting, because they were only using simulation to fill in the gaps, they were getting extremely incomplete models. And then when they tried to rely greater on those models, they didn't have the robustness necessary. And so they realized that even though they could do physical tests, they had to invest in the models to replace those so that they could get to the point where those models became complete. And it was that change of thinking where just because they could measure it in the laboratory and not simulate it, they were preventing simulation from actually offering the full value, as you alluded to, and they see today. The medical device industry, a few of the companies now are beginning to understand that. We work with a number of them, and I mean, in particular, we see of all organizations, the FDA, who talk to their peers in other industries, in automotive and aerospace, how they use simulation, and they realize that that is such an essential tool to the regulatory process that they are investing heavily. So if we can help the medical device industry through that transformation where simulation goes from being the secondary tool to being the primary tool by running physical tests that are specifically targeted towards making those models complete. And that is where the transformation happens.
I think that's you answered a question I had, which is something, Stuart, you mentioned, which is the automotive industry and other industries are using simulation systematically. And I was about to ask you, what would that look like? And I think, Steve, you definitely hit on that, where a company that invests in trying to build more complete models, trying to make simulation primary, is going to, in the long run, you know, get classified as somebody who uses simulation systematically, because they're implementing not just the investment to learn how to use simulation, but also to use simulation to build models specifically so they can increase the predictability of their products ultimately. Is that somewhat in the right vein of what, Stuart, you were saying?
Yeah, for me, systematic use of simulation really means a number of things. But let's put it in the context of a program. It means that it's written in the program that thou shalt make certain decisions at certain points in the program based upon simulation. Thou shalt optimize the weight of this component using simulation, and thou shalt not use prototyping and physical testing to verify performance of that part until such and such a time. So it's a business-based decision that says we have enough confidence in simulation that, and it's demonstrated to be sufficiently less expensive than any alternatives, that is our mode of design and validation in a certain situation. And those situations are manifold. There's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of those situations within an automotive program. Parts are changing, those ladder up to all overall performance changes and impacts, and those performance changes and those impacts have to be validated and evaluated, and the least expensive way to do it in that industry is using simulation. But it does come down to what confidence do we have? This is a subject that we've touched on before, and we'll continue to touch on it, more than touch on it. It's central. What confidence do we have in simulation? And how do we assure that that confidence is sufficiently high, given the context of those decisions that are being made based upon it? Making sure that the risk of basing decisions on simulation is low enough, and making sure that we have the most economical methodology.
I think sorry, I think putting it in terms of the commandments, really uh, helps a listener see that what a systemic use or systematic implementation of using something like simulation could look like. So you're saying that businesses should, I'm not saying they should release commandments, but you could say that a business that sits down and says that any kind of product decision or product optimization decision that we made has to be validated through simulation, or any kind of technological breakthrough that we're trying to implement, or any device that's coming out which is trying a novel approach, it needs to be validated with scientific models or mathematical models that are generated through simulation and not physical testing. Should a business be doing that nowadays? Considering that the cost of prototyping for newer products is considerably going down with additive manufacturing, you've got more options for contract manufacturers. So, for a medical device company to say that we're going to categorically choose simulation every time to drive decision, the term you used previously, Stuart, was to provide decision support, is it could be a hard decision to make, knowing that the cost of prototyping is generally declining over the years.
Of course, it is. It's a difficult decision to make, and the medical device industry has always erred on the side of let's do a bench test or let's validate that um, with cadaver testing or animal testing. But those are very expensive and very time consuming. But let's think in should every company be doing this? My belief is yes. Now, every company, in my belief, I'm a little bit of a purist at times and a little bit of a pain in the neck at times when it comes to this idea of systems engineering. And I think every company should be taking a systems engineering overview and point of view of product development and um, program engineering. And what that means is up front, front loaded in a program, they're figuring out how are they going to engineer this product and how are they going to validate the performance of this product. That's a key tenet of systems engineering. And that let's separate the two disciplines a little. You have design and engineering, where you're iterating on the functionality of the design and you're improving it, and making sure it meets targets uh, theoretically or on the bench. And then there's the validation steps that happen when you start prototyping and building products. Now, back to the beginning of this question, it's a difficult decision to make what methodology to use. Yes, it is. It's an economic decision and it's a risk based decision. And it's that balance that has to be um, considered when choosing at the program level how am I going to validate something. And confidence in simulation is something that is still generally lacking in medical device companies, in program leadership, in project management, and even down at engineering and design levels. Confidence is lacking, and confidence needs to be elevated and built up to the levels that we see in other industries. And that comes from discipline. It comes from a systematic approach to executing simulation, not just to plan its usage and its employment, but how do we actually do it? With what personnel? In what manner do we do it? With what tools do we do it? With what controls do we do it? And all of those things add up to a level of confidence in simulation, which we can balance against the risk of basing decisions on simulation, and against that balance of cost. What's our alternative?
So, Stuart, there are a couple of things you hit there. I definitely want to go down the rabbit hole for systems engineering and what kind of implications that might have for a business that's trying to get started with that or trying to implement it. But I want to touch on something you just closed with, which is the confidence is lacking. And what's something we've discussed previously, which is regulatory bodies becoming more accepting, the FDA becoming more accepting of scientific evidence and mathematical evidence generated through simulation or robust simulation, or at least providing a reporting guideline so that they can feel comfortable that the data that's being generated is accurate and defensible enough. So, from a technical standpoint, I feel that the audience or the customers, companies can be made aware of the fact that choosing simulation is beneficial. But something else you also said, it's because they may not know where to get started. And I think that's a big part of implementing a new strategy, or quite essentially implementing a new commandment of product development, which is I draw a parallel between aerospace, automotive, medical devices, and high tech. And yes, does seem to be this gap in the knowledge of where to get started when it comes to implementing simulation. A lot of companies today do some level and some fidelity of simulation. They'll use a low-end tool, generally something that's relatively inexpensive on the market, something that can do structural simulation, something that can do some level of CFD, at least some level of predictability with CFD. I don't know how many companies do electromagnetic simulations. They probably should. I don't know how many do it. I know some companies do, impact testing, drop testing, contact testing, thermal testing. So there is some usage. But then when you talk about using simulation to build models, using simulation to generate data that can, inform predictive or predictably inform product decisions and provide decision support. So I feel that a lot of that is because of that gap, is that people don't know, or companies don't know where to get started. How would they bridge that gap, in your opinion?
I think it starts with an intent to seriously look at the alternative to product development that is completely physical test centric. And that intent necessarily gets enabled by hiring the right people, the people who are capable of bringing simulation into the organization, people who perhaps come from other industries. There's an awful lot of that takes place. You'll find a very large number of simulation specialists within medical device industry that have come from automotive or aerospace, or indeed from companies like ourselves. People have moved from Somulia, for example, and become employees of our customers because of their specialization. But then you have to plan for it. You have to plan the simulation capabilities that you need. What is a core differentiator in your product? We're coming back to the idea of innovation. What is your innovation portfolio, and what are you actually trying to do? What does innovation look like? And therefore, what demands does it put on your engineering organization? And therefore, transpose those or convert those demands to the demands on your validation and design methodologies. And if you see areas where there's an opportunity for utilizing simulation, then think it through and plan for its adoption. Plan for developing the capability level that you need. So there's a whole idea of capability maturity of simulation. It starts with, I don't have simulation. Then it goes to, I have directional simulation, which means the results aren't very good, but they can tell me that if I make something thicker, I'm moving in the right direction. If I make something out of a stiffer plastic, I'm moving in the right direction. That's directional simulation. Then you have qualitative simulation. That's better. That allows you to make tell the difference between choices A and choice A and choice B, and know that if I follow path B, it's better for these reasons. I might not be able to quantify it exactly, but I know that it is better. Then you have quantitative simulation. Quantitative gives me numbers. I can now compare two targets. I can say I need to carry a load of this with a maximum deflection of that. Um, can I do that with this design? And simulation tells you quantitatively whether you can or you can't. And then finally, at the very top, you have what we call predictive simulation. And predictive is where it's so reliable and sufficiently accurate that it exceeds the capability of a physical test. And we know that we can eliminate that physical test because simulation is good enough, dependable enough, accurate enough, and cost effective enough to use instead of physical tests. So you have to think in those terms too. You have to think in terms of capability, maturity, development along these different simulation capability paths, be they structural or fluid or electromagnetic or any other, and build a matrix, build a plan for how you're going to develop that. And decisions will be made that include decisions like, yes, we should own that capability because it is a strategic differentiator to us, or it's going to underpin a core innovation within our product. So we need to own that simulation capability, which means bring it in-house and do it ourselves. Or there'll be other alternatives where we say, where we look at it and we say, we don't do it often enough. It's not a core requirement. It's a valuable capability, though, not sufficiently valuable to own. Therefore, we'll use an Aventec or another service provider to do it on our behalf. But it's still all part of a plan. What do we own? What do we outsource? And what role does it play in any particular program according to the innovative content that that program has and the economics of the program and getting the job done?
I think that's a great way. I really love the way you literally gave me a direction, which was no simulation all the way to predictive simulation. And I think you concluded that pretty nicely as well, which is a company could take a look at their current business systems and say that in this particular aspect of what we're doing today, we would like to eliminate physical testing. Now, it may not be that the physical test costs too much. It just might be that the physical test is unnecessary. Or it can. Sometimes it's worthwhile doing it simply because they can. That's all the time we have for today, folks. But do know that this discussion will continue into the fifth and final part of the Accelerate webinar series. So be sure to check out the final parts where we will dive a little bit more into bringing to light some concerns that we have observed you might have. If you have questions or comments about the conversation you've seen so far, you can reach us at www.aventec.com/contact us or call us at 905 305 1711. Until then, this is Shashank, your host and moderator. Thank you once again to our panelists, and thank you for listening. It's been a pleasure.